In Chapter 1, we discussed a variety of errors that can occur as people seek to understand their social world. In Chapter 2, we discussed that social work researchers seek answers to questions that they are interested in and believe to be important. In this chapter, we will discuss both ethical guidelines and scientific guidelines for conducting research. Concern for ethical practices with research conducted on people is not a new idea and can be traced back as far as Hippocrates in 5 BC. The Hippocratic Oath, an ethical code attributed to the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, was adopted as a guide to conduct by the medical profession throughout the ages and is still used in the graduation ceremonies of many medical schools. The Nuremberg war crime trials that occurred post-World War II was an example that merely having an ethical code was not enough to ensure ethical practices. The Nuremberg war crime criminals were held between 1945 to 1949 and exposed to horrific experiments conducted by Nazi doctors on human subjects. As the war reached its end in 1945, the Allies had become aware of appalling atrocities that had taken place in Eastern Europe, which was later called the Holocaust. The outrage caused by these appalling discoveries led to a clamor amongst the Allies, those responsible who should be brought to account for what was happening. A more recent event that occurred as late as 1972 in the U.S. that sparked outrage with regards to how human beings were treated for the sake of research was the Tuskegee experiment. For 40 years, between 1932 and 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted an experiment on 399 black men in the late stages of syphilis. These men, for the most part, were illiterate sharecroppers from one of the poorest counties in Alabama, were never told what disease they were suffering from or of its seriousness. Informed that they were being treated for bad blood, their doctors had no intention of curing them of syphilis at all. The data for the experiment was to be collected from the autopsies of the men, and they were thus deliberately left to degenerate under the ravages of the syphilis. The study was meant to discover how syphilis affected blacks as opposed to whites, the theory being that whites experienced more neurological complications from syphilis, whereas blacks would be more susceptible to cardiovascular disease. Based on these historical events, it was clear that a formal review procedure needed to be conducted to protect research participants. The U.S. government created a National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. In 1979, the Belmont Report was created to establish 3 basic ethical principles. 1. Respect for persons and treating those persons as autonomous agents and protecting those with diminished autonomy. 2. Benefits, minimizing possible harm and maximizing benefits. And 3. Justice, distributing benefits and risks of research fairly. Federal regulations require that every institution that seeks federal funding for biomedical or behavioral research on human subjects must have an instructional or institutional review board, or IRB. The IRB at NC State, its mission of the IRB is to facilitate compliant research with human subjects, and there's 3 primary goals. First, to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects through project review. Second, to foster compliance with institutional policy and federal regulations by facilitating institutional personnel efforts and utilizing living human subjects for research and other scholarly pursuits that are systematic and designed to contribute to generalized knowledge. Third, to provide education to an institution personnel on ethical use of human subjects, helping scientists and instructors be stellar stewards and of the trust of our human subjects is paramount concern. The National Association of Social Workers, or NASW, also has a code of ethics incorporated into both its practice standards and evaluation research standards. Like other professional social science organizations, the NASW has also incorporated these standards into their ethical code. Research should cause no physical or mental harm to subjects. Subjects must give their informed consent to participate in the research, if capable. If not, then assent must be obtained from an appropriate proxy. Participation in research should be voluntary, and participants should be informed of their right to withdraw at any time without penalty. Researchers should fully disclose their identity, and social workers doing research should avoid conflicts of interest and reveal possible conflicts with potential participants. Should avoid conflicts of interest and reveal possible conflicts with potential participants. Autonomy or confidentiality must be maintained for individual research participants. Findings should be reported accurately. Errors later found should also be corrected. The benefits of research projects should outweigh any foreseeable risks, and social workers should take steps to ensure that participants have access to appropriate supportive services. As the title states, no harm to the participants. People being researched should never be injured, whether it be physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, or psychologically. Is it possible to eliminate 100% of the risks? Milgram in 1963 was interested in researching how far people would go in obeying instruction if involved in harming another person. Stanley Milgram was interested in how easily ordinary people could be influenced in committing atrocities, for example, like the Germans in World War II. Volunteers were recruited for a lab experiment investigating learning. Participants were 40 males aged between the ages of 20 and 50 whose jobs ranged from unskilled to professional. They were paid just $4.50 for turning up. At the beginning of the experiment, the participants were introduced to another participant who was actually a Confederate of the experiment. They drew straws to determine their roles, learner or teacher. Although this was fixed and the Confederate was always the learner, there was also an experimenter dressed in a gray lab coat played by an actor. 2 rooms in the interaction laboratory were used, one for the learner with an electric chair and another for the teacher and experimenter with electric shock generator. The learner was strapped to a chair with electrodes. After he has learned a list of pairs given to him to learn, the teacher tests him by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner pair from a list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of shock each time. The learner mainly gave wrong answers on purpose, and for each of these the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter was given a series of orders to ensure they continued. Interesting enough, 83.7% of the participants in the study surveyed later said they were very glad to have participated in the study and no evidence of psychological trauma was recorded. However, these findings were not supported and the need to eliminate deception from research was developed. These are potential examples of research studies in which the purpose and the methodology may lead to psychological harm down the road. For example, divorce studies that ask young children sensitive questions such as which parent they would prefer, asking people with mental retardation about their past experiences of being victims of sexual exploitation, asking people with mental illness, particularly people with psychotic episodes, about their dreams, casually asking older adults to share their feelings about loved ones who have been lost through death. Maintaining privacy and confidentiality is key for protecting research participants. This means that nobody but the research personnel should have access to information that could link responses to their respondents. These are examples of research studies that could have potential issues with maintaining privacy. Asking about the person's sexual practices, asking about alcohol or drug practices, asking parents to share their feelings about their child who had a disability, exploring marital status issues, exploring a person's sexual orientation, exploring a person's diagnosis, whether a mental illness, cognitive disability, or physical condition. Informed consent is the process by which potential participants are given all the information they need to decide whether to participate in a study or not. Information given should include the purpose of the study, the procedures involved, potential risks, and benefits. Informed consent must also ensure all participants that there are no ramifications if they choose not to participate and can discontinue their participation at any time. Children cannot give consent to participate, but can give or withhold their assent to participate even if their legal guardians have consented. There are special protections for vulnerable populations such as prisoners, mentally ill, persons with disabilities, economically or educationally disadvantaged, and elderly. Consent must be given voluntarily and without coercion. To whatever extent possible, they also must be reminded that there is no penalty for refusing to participate or stopping participation at any time. Other vulnerable groups: people who lack resources or autonomy, people who are stigmatized by society, people who are in a weakened position, perhaps in an institutional setting, people who cannot speak for themselves and their best interest, people whose illegal activities may become known to law enforcement, or people associated with research participants who may be damaged by data revealed. Anonymity and confidentiality. Anonymity, or the guarantee in a research project when neither the researcher nor the readers of the findings can identify a given response with a given respondent. Confidentiality, guaranteed when the research can identify a given person's responses, but promises not to do so publicly. The law does allow research records to be subpoenaed. Researchers may also be required to report child abuse or release information if a life-threatening situation arises and the participants need to be alerted. The National Institute of Health conditions a certificate of competency to protect researchers from being legally required to disclose confidential information. For example, researchers who focus on high-risk populations or behaviors such as crime, drug abuse, sexual activity can request a certificate. However, suspicions of child abuse or neglect must always be reported, and in some states, elder abuse must also be reported. Deception within the social research needs to be justified by scientific or administrative concerns. Debriefing or interviewing subjects to learn about their experiences of the participation in the project after the research is conducted is a way of eliminating that deception at the end of a research project. In Milgram's experiment, deception was essential to get the results he wanted. However, this type of experiment would probably not be approved by today's IRB. For analysis and reporting, we have an ethical obligation to our colleagues in the scientific community to report all our findings. Research findings and results should be presented openly and honestly. This includes avoiding or leaving out any contradictory information. Untrue or deceptive statements should be avoided in all reports. The limits and boundaries of inference should be clearly delineated. This may include considerations of the subject sample for participation or the level of experimental variables. Complete and clear documentation must be provided, learning how the data was edited, the statistical procedures used, and the assumptions made about the data. And finally, the role of data analysis is ideally neutral, so the statistical procedures may be applied without concern for a favorable outcome. Ethical issues may arise from the kinds of problems social scientists investigate, the methods or procedures used to obtain valid and reliable data, exposure to conditions that may involve some harm to subjects, the research setting or where the research takes place, a hospital, a prison, a public school, the kinds of persons serving as research participants, poor, children, mental patients, the type of data collected, sensitive information. Once again, the purpose of this chapter was to discuss the ethical guidelines and scientific guidelines for conducting research.